Yeah, sort of rebelled against the idea of the unlikable quote unquote character. That was kind of a term that cultural gatekeepers would use both to dismiss a female character that we just kind of don't find that pleasant or that like sweet. But so the unlikable female character was kind of an idea I wanted to, like with Cate in the Outlier, she was really fun to write, because she is a psychopath, even though she's not a killer. And it was just fun to not have to kind of like couch her in all this like niceness and pleasantness. It was.
This week, I got to talk with Elisabeth Eaves, who is the author of The Outlier, which is a psychological thriller that has been called the corrective to the psychopath thriller. So here's what it's about. Cate Winter, at 34, is a wildly successful neuroscientist and entrepreneur who has invented a cure for Alzheimer's that will improve the lives of millions. On the verge of selling her biotech company for an obscene sum, she is also about to become very rich. But Cate has a secret that keeps her deeply uneasy about everything she is. She grew up at the Cleckley Institute, a treatment facility for the rehabilitation of psychopathic children. And as far as she knows, she's the institute's only success. All of her peers have become thwarted, maladjusted, or even criminal adults. Then Cate discovers the existence of another ex-patient and outlier who might prove that her success isn't a fluke. He has not only stayed out of jail, but he's made a mark in business and science. Though his identity is confidential, she breaks the rules and drops everything to track him down. And when she finds him living under an assumed name in Baja California, she's immediately obsessed. Like her, he is driven and brilliant, an innovator willing to do what it takes to perfect a new energy technology that will stop global warming. Here, at last, is her mirror, her ultimate collaborator, the possible answer to the enigma of her nature. But in the wake of a mysterious death, Cate can't avoid suspecting him. If he is involved, do his ends justify his means? Ruthless herself, she's about to find out whether there are any more lines she won't cross. This book is a really unique take on the psychopath thriller, with the rehab that she grew up in as a child as a really interesting point, and also brings in some really interesting elements of business and the environment. So if you love your thrillers, a mashup of all of those things, or you love a thriller with one of those things, you will probably really enjoy this book. But for now, let's hear from Elisabeth. Before we dive into The Outlier, I did want to get to know a little bit about you. So when did you know you wanted to write, or when did you know you wanted to write a book?
I was a kid who always loved language and history and English class and those kinds of things. So there was kind of a natural desire to write. And then after college, I started getting more into like, what can I do here? How can I do more creative writing? And I realized one of the few things you could do as a writer and get paid and do it as a profession was to become a journalist. And so I did that. And I kind of come out of journalism as a creative writer. So I did that for years. I loved it. I love reporting and asking people a million questions to learn about their lives or whatever they do. And somewhere along the way, I wrote my first two books, which were nonfiction books. Mm-hmm. So my last one was a travel memoir because I was a very obsessive traveler. And then after that, I was trying to figure out another book topic, and I really do love narrative nonfiction, like those writers like David Gran or Rachel Aviv, who write these incredible narratives that are nonfiction, but I couldn't find the right subject. Like I had kind of themes and ideas, and I'd always had some interest in fiction. I had, stories on my hard drive. I'd never published anything. And so then I decided now it's time to write fiction. Yeah. And I wrote one novel, which my agent shopped and we didn't sell it. And so then I wrote another one, and this is The Outlier, the one that's come out now.
Yeah, that's quite a writing journey. What do you think about writing as a journalist and nonfiction writer? How did that inform your writing when you went to start writing fiction?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are some skills that translate over really well.
Mhm.
Certain types of writing, like I think journalists are pretty good at writing dialogue.
Mhm.
We're pretty good at writing setting, I think, and kind of picking out those details for writing a setting. We're good at self editing, which is actually an incredibly important task. Like,
Yeah.
how do you narrow this down and make it not like sprawl all over the place, even if you have all
Mhm.
this stuff you want to include? So, those things I think translate over well. And then there's things you just really have to unlearn too, like the style of, well, depending what kind of journalism you're talking about. But if you're talking about like news, the style is very choppy, right? It's like fact,
Mhm.
fact, 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 quote, fact, 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 quote.
Mhm.
Um, and you are thinking about proving all your points, like
Yeah.
here's the quote, here's the source, here's, the documentation. And in fiction, you don't have to do that, and you don't want to do that because it takes the flow away, I think. So like fiction just be plausible, but it doesn't have to be
Yeah.
true because it's fiction. So
Yeah.
the writing's a little more flowing and longer paragraphs, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So I think there were things I definitely had to unlearn.
Mm.
Like I had this instinct to want to like document reality in a very accurate way, and I had to like
Yeah.
just let go of that and think about
Mhm.
like what's the best story to tell here.
Yeah. You do see some of how that is useful though in the outlier, where there are times where like you're like, I just need this to be delivering facts about it,
Yeah,
basically. So that's cool. I can kind of see how that played into it.
yeah.
How did your writing process evolve with fiction? Do you plan ahead? Do you plot? Are you a plotter? Are you a pantser? Like, what's your
Mhm.
process?
So I go back and forth, and I kind of don't believe there are pure plotters and pure
Yeah.
pantsers, although maybe people would dispute me on that. My method is, well, I think it was different for my, because I'm working on a new novel now, and then I worked on that
Mm.
other novel before, so it's changed a little for each time. But
Yeah.
I think like the best method for me now is to make an outline, but don't make it um, too
Rigid.
long, or
Oh yeah.
have like too much detail or too step by step, but kind of have that loose outline,
Hmm.
and then start drafting, and then probably go do more research. So I will have probably done research before that first draft, write the first
Yep.
draft, but then do more research because I don't really know what I'm missing until I have that draft. I don't know where the
Yeah.
holes are. Um, and then I will also, as I'm writing, be making my outline more precise.
Yeah.
So I may, as even though I had that earlier outline, I may, as I go along, realize I want these new characters or realize how I want the ending to be different. So I'll
Mhm.
kind of go, I'll kind of go back and forth essentially.
Yeah. That makes sense. I do think a lot of people are actually more a hybrid version of it,
Mm-hmm.
probably. So with the outlier, you have a non-traditional female as the main character, and it also there's a little bit of travel involved, like traveling into Mexico and stuff. So I know your two nonfiction books, Wanderlust has to do with traveling, and Bear really tackled like working as a stripper, which is not negative, but is a non-traditional female vocation, basically. So, did anything from those books kind of inform this book?
Yeah, I think I've always sort of rebelled against the idea of the unlikable, quote, unlikable female character.
Mhm.
That was kind of a term that cultural gatekeepers would use for a long time, probably more in Hollywood than in publishing, but to some extent in both. to dismiss a female character that we just kind of don't find that pleasant or that like sweet or traditionally feminine. And I do think that's changed now. Like now we have all
Mhm.
kinds of, assassins and like
Yeah.
just slobs and like sort of quote unquote unpleasant people now all over in books and film. So that's a great change. But so the unlikable female character was kind of an idea I was rebelling against and like
Mhm.
um, wanted to, like with Cate in the Outlier, she was really fun to write, because she
Yeah.
is a psychopath, even though she's not a killer. And it was just fun to not have to kind of like couch her in all this like niceness and pleasantness. It was
Mhm.
very liberating. As for how that relates to my earlier books, I'm trying to think about this carefully. I mean, with Bear, which is about strippers and other dancers, but also myself in that profession, like if you're going to do that and you're going to do it by choice, you kind of have to not care that much
Mhm.
whether people are going to disapprove of what you're doing. Like you kind of just have to throw that aside and not worry too much about what
Mhm.
people think of you and
Yeah.
what you're doing. So I think that comes through in the Cate
Mhm.
character. Um, and then, of course, my travel writing in general, both in Wanderlust, my memoir, and then also, when I was a journalist, I kind of went through some phases. So I was
Mhm.
a business writer, and then I was a travel writer, and then I was a science writer. That's essentially how I would divide up my journalism career.
Mhm.
So all that travel writing, I think, absolutely informs the Outlier, both the landscapes in Baja,
Mhm.
the little beach town, which is also a tourist town, and like the tensions in that town kind of revolve around. There's some tension between like the locals and the newcomers and the tourists, and that's something I've seen certainly in a lot of places in Mexico, but also all over the world. So both on the positive and the negative side, I think, yeah, my travel writing is present in the Outlier. And I think that'll be true probably in all fiction I write. Like I'll want to,
Yeah.
have these hopefully interesting settings.
Right. Yeah, that's really cool. Um, so some of the marketing about this when I received it was calling The Outlier a corrective to the psychopath thriller.
Mm-hmm.
So one, what drew you to having a psychopathic main character, and what did you feel like needed to kind of be corrected with it?
Mm-hmm. So obviously, like all of us, I've like watched shows and read books about psychopath, like very kind of evil, bad people. And then there's the pop culture reference. We'll sort of casually call people like a psychopath or a sociopath if they
Yeah.
do something really unsavory. So I was exposed to all that, and then for a few reasons, I became very interested in kind of the brain side of that, and like
Yeah.
how the brain works and how the clinical and scientific community actually understands psychopathy as a neurodevelopmental disorder, like a developmental
Mhm.
disorder. Like there's many of them that we're aware of now, ADHD and autism. And I'm not saying that like psychopathy is like those things, but that they are a spectrum disorder, so people can have a
Yes.
little bit or a lot, and that it really has to do with how the brain is shaped and how it functions. So I became very interested in that side of it and that background to it. And then um, a couple of works of nonfiction really inspired and interested me. So one was a long magazine story um, by Barbara Haggerty in The Atlantic. This is, I don't know, probably 7 or something years ago.
Okay.
And it was about children who are identified as um, psychopathic or sort of proto psychopaths. That's in the clinical community, they call them callous and unfeeling children. I think because they don't, you don't want to write call
Yeah.
it a psychopath. But there's a whole clinical community and facilities where doctors are essentially trying to train and educate young people who are like this. And I found that really fascinating, like the whole idea that this is something you could screen for and identify early and potentially um, educate people in such a way that they become productive members of society and not, go off the rails in a criminal direction. So I was
Mm-hmm.
very interested in that. I read another book that's a memoir by James Fallon, who um, is a neuroscientist and had been studying people like this, and then he complicated story, but he essentially gets his own brain scan mixed up with the brain scans of like psychopaths who he's studying, and he realizes that like his brain looks just like theirs, like it's the same pattern. And so then he realizes that he is in fact a psychopath. So
Oh
this
my gosh.
actually happened. This guy like wrote about it. I think he did a TED talk. So that
Wow.
fascinated me too.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then also like probably my personal experience. So my mom was a child psychologist, and so there was a lot of dinner table talk about like brain development in young
Mm.
children. So that probably informed things too.
Yeah. Yeah. That I want to read about this guy who discovered he was a psychopath when he was studying psychopaths. That
Yeah.
is wild. I'm definitely gonna be looking that up. What drew you to writing a thriller, or did you just kind of have a story and you told it and then you realized it was a thriller?
It was definitely the latter. I didn't know that I was writing a thriller at first. I think for
Mhm.
subsequent novels, I will have a clearer idea
Yeah.
going forward. But I just I had these ideas and these characters and themes,
Hmm.
and it was kind of as I was writing that I realized I wanted to have this cat and mouse and kind of you know cataclysmic collision between these
Yeah.
two people. And that's really when I knew more like what it was. It was like much later in the game than when I set out.
Yeah. Yeah. So you mentioned that you read an article about like kids who were or, like doctors who were trying to kind of deal with kids with those traits.
Mm-hmm.
And in the book, Cate basically she kind of grew up in Cleckley Institute for Psychopathic Children.
Mm-hmm.
Um, did you do any further research on like how to create that environment and like what would be going on there?
Not really. I mean, Cleckley is totally fictional.
Right.
um, I mean, I know there are facilities that treat children like this. I think the more fictional aspect in Cleckley is that it's like a whole school and kids
Hmm.
stay there for years. So it's kind of a combination of like a boarding school and a reform school and a clinical
Yeah.
facility. So that part is totally fictional. I
Yeah.
made that up. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you do any other research into psychopathy itself?
Yeah, a lot of reading, like both academic reading and popular
Mhm.
science reading. There's a professor emeritus named Bob Hare who is kind of considered like the pioneer of studying psychopathy in
Okay.
criminal populations, and like really kind of wrote the book. Like he, has a list of like he has a whole assessment tool that is the assessment tool that's used
Yeah.
now. So read a lot kind of by him and about him.
Hmm.
Um, and then like popular books like there's one called The Psychopath Inside, I think. There's a one called The Psychopath Test that's by a really funny journalist named John Ronson.
Nice.
There's kind of a major psychologist in the UK called um, Simon Baron Cohen, who's written a book about like brains that don't have empathy or people who don't have
Mhm.
empathy. So kind of a range of from the more academic side to like the more popular science side.
Yeah, that's really cool. I hope you're enjoying this episode of Bookwild. And if you are, could I ask you a favor? Could you go and rate and review this podcast on whatever platform you're listening? Ratings and reviews make the biggest difference in discoverability of the podcast, and I definitely want to find all of our fellow thriller readers out there. So if you could go rate the podcast and leave a short review, that would make a huge difference. Thank you, and let's get back to the show. The other thing that's kind of cool, the way you use her psychopathy, is she is able to find a cure for Alzheimer's, but she's able to do it because she does some morally gray things, but it's benefiting so many people in the future, so it's kind of justifiable. So how did you approach that tension of kind of like showing how some of her skills could be useful, even if they're kind of damaging at the moment?
Yeah, like she's a ferociously focused person, but like to the point where she could just like ignore everyone in her life for 5 days. Ferociously ambitious, but also really smart. And she has this business partner who's much more like contains her somewhat and is like more the face of the company and kind of like normalizes Cate somewhat. So I'm sorry, I forget what the question was.
You're totally fine. Like, how did you approach the nuance of like, she did some bad things to cure it, but she cured Alzheimer's?
Yeah. So that came out of, so when I was a business reporter and like I worked at Forbes magazine, which does like this billionaires list every year and obviously covers a lot of founders and CEOs. And I became very fascinated with this idea of like the figure in tech, usually in tech, who does invent something world changing, but, might be like a pretty big jerk in other respects. And we're all like, I'm not going to name names, right? But we can all think of these like CEOs and founders that we talk about now. So I was very interested in that.
Named a name. I almost named a name.
Yes. Well, I mean, we all know who we're talking about. So that was really interesting to me. And like, I don't think there's an easy answer, but it's kind of a philosophical question of, I think there is a philosophical test where like, if you're going down a railway track, and you could go this way and you're going to kill like 5 people who you don't know, and you could shift tracks and you'll kill one person who you do know, like which is the better course of action. So I think that's something philosophers talk about. But it's kind of like that. It's like, well, if this person has these traits we think of as negative, and yet they can channel those into, doing something amazing that kind of changes the world, like how are we supposed to think about those people? And I mean, I kind of come down on the side of like, if she invented a cure for Alzheimer's, like great, like good for her. Like she doesn't have to also be a nice person.
Correct.
And then of course the person she's kind of chasing in the book is also sort of in that category, or he's like her, which is why she's trying to go find him.
Yeah. With that relationship, you can feel how like she would love the idea that someone else is like her. Like, I think it's on the synopsis that she's like one of few who didn't go to jail as adults after being a part of the study, and then she finds out someone else was. But you can feel how she kind of like wants to be able to like kind of have a sense of community or see herself reflected in someone else, make herself feel even a little bit more normal. So how did you kind of approach the fact that she is a psychopath, but she also like kind of really wants this relationship that might feel affirming?
Yeah, like how I had to think about a lot about like, so what is she actually like? So psychopathy, like I said, is a spectrum disorder, which means you can have a little bit or a lot. And one of the traits is lack of empathy. Another trait is like a low depth of feeling, or they call it shallow affect, but essentially it means like you have feelings, but you don't like feel things very hard. So I kind of decided, well, like, okay, like she doesn't have a large depth of feeling, but she still has some, like, where she does want to have these connections in life. So I had to really decide kind of which psychopathic traits were going to be most prominent in her. Like, she's definitely like a risk taker and a thrill seeker for sure.
Yeah.
She's kind of like looking for that feeling. Like, she's kind of looking to give herself stronger feelings. So she does really, she's like an extreme sports person.
Yeah.
So I just had to sort of decide and calibrate, like, what is this person actually like? And I think the fact that she's, such a unique person because she's come out of this institute and she's like succeeded greatly in life, but she doesn't know anybody like her. And there's kind of like nobody in the world you can talk to about this institution that she grew up in. So when she finds out about him, she really feels this sense of like, oh my God, there's like this person just like me. I have to go find him. So she's drawn to him, and she has these connections like with her old mentor and her business partner. So she does have like a few human connections in the world.
Yeah. Yeah, she does. The other thing that the story examines is the environment and global warming, and how sometimes our efforts to even improve the environment, there's also still like damage that comes from going after something like that. So what drew you to kind of including some of this like environmental science aspect part of it too?
So I'm going to sound like such a wonk, which I kind of am. So I was very interested in this idea of the unintended consequences of exciting new technology and how many of them are kind of a double-edged sword. And that probably comes out of the fact that I worked for this publication for 7 or 8 years mostly as an editor that covers nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, climate change, biological weapons, essentially like human invented technology that could kill everybody really quickly, right? If things go wrong.
Yeah.
So that place is called the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. They're the ones who do the doomsday clock, if you've ever heard of that. So,
okay.
Yeah, I've been working there for a while, and so just constantly thinking about these themes of existential threat. And you look around in our world and we're seeing it constantly. It's like, okay, we need carbon-free technology. Let's have hydropower. Well, okay, hydropower does all these things to like the fish, right? And it's like, okay, well, let's have wind power. It's like, well, wind power is troublesome for the birds. So, I think, or like nuclear is like this amazing carbon-free energy source, but it has this little radioactive waste problem that upsets people. So I feel like we're constantly seeing that as the world tries to solve these problems. Like there's people now who are getting all excited about geoengineering, which is you sort of like seed the clouds to cool the world. Well, like, it's great if it works, but it's also kind of like terrifying if it doesn't work. So these are just things going on in our world that I was very interested in. And like, there's kind of maybe a bit of a tendency to get really excited, and like a new technology, there'll be a lot of hype around it. And then people don't totally think about like, what are the impacts of this going to be? So,
it was really thought-provoking in both like the environmental part, and Cate as a character is really thought-provoking too. It's interesting too because it's like you kind of gain more empathy for psychopaths while like sometimes that's the thing they have the least of. But I just thought it was cool how you pulled all of those elements together into one book.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I kind of just layered in different obsessions of mine, basically. Like stuffed it all in there. So.
I mean, I feel like it makes sense, like write about the stuff that you're already excited about. So at the end, I've been asking people if they have read anything recently that they loved, but I know some people don't read while they're writing, so it's okay if you don't have any.
Yeah. So, I mean, I could. So, if we're talking about newer books, so
Any,
um,
yeah.
I sort of in the broad thriller category, what I tend to read the most are murder mysteries and spy stories. Those are kind of my two
Me too.
fun go-tos. So those will be several of my recommendations. But like I love the author Tana French, if you know who that is. She has
Yes.
this series of murder mysteries set in Ireland. And I think
So
she's a
good.
fantastic writer. So she had a new book out this year that's called The Hunter, I think. Um, sorry, one second. I actually like wrote this stuff down because I'm always afraid of blanking in the moment. So like
Oh, I
I made
get
a
it.
list of like my favorite books. But yeah, so her new book that came out this year is called The Hunter, and it's set in like a tiny rural town in Ireland, and she I think she's an amazing writer because her writing is really really atmospheric. Like you really get the sense that you're in these places, and her writing's like very flowing and
Mhm.
kind of beautifully descriptive, and then there's like a murder mystery kind of
Yeah.
embedded in that. So she's great. The writer Jean Hanff Korelitz, who wrote The
Mhm.
Plot a few years ago,
Oh
she
yeah.
has a new book coming out in the fall, which I'm excited about.
Yeah.
Um, it's called The Sequel. So I think it's also like playing with these ideas of like who gets to tell what stories, and then like stories
Mhm.
being stolen from one person, one writer to another.
Yes.
Um, and then just some recent thrillers, like there's a new one out. I think it's coming out in August. I have an arc
Mhm.
called The Divide by Morgan Richter, and
Mhm.
it's like set in Hollywood, and it's kind of a doppelganger story of like someone looks
Yeah.
just like somebody else, and maybe you've seen it because it's
I
the
do.
art.
I have a copy of it.
Okay, yeah,
Yeah. The
um,
cover's so cool.
yeah, the palm trees,
Yeah.
um, and then like I think you've talked about Rabbit Hole on your
I
podcast by
have.
Kate Brody. I thought that
Yes.
was a really good, combination of like beautiful writing, and then this,
Mhm.
um, the rabbit hole is like a Reddit rabbit hole, kind of true
Yeah.
crime rabbit hole. So
Yeah.
yeah, those are some things that I'm like, yeah, into right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Rabbit Hole is so emotional and very
Mhm.
powerful for sure.
Yeah,
So prepare yourself for an emotional one.
yeah, yeah.
But it's
Warning,
great.
warning, like PSA,
Yeah.
depending on
Yeah.
what you're looking for. Yeah,
Yeah, it's really great. But yeah, it's powerful and
yeah,
heartbreaking at times.
yeah,
Which is good that she conveyed it all.
yeah.
Where can people follow you on social media to keep up to date with everything?
So I'm just gonna say Instagram, Instagram, Instagram because
Yep.
like I really like just focusing on one social
Same.
media and not trying to be everywhere. So yeah, it's just my name, which is Elisabeth with an S.
Hmm.
Eaves, that's like Eaves on a house. So it's at Elisabeth Eaves on Instagram.
Yeah. Awesome. I will have those links in the show notes. And thank you so much for coming and talking with me.
Thank you. Really fun to talk with you, Kate.